Marshall here. Welcome back to the Realignment. Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. Today's episode features a return appearance by former NATO Allied Supreme Commander Admiral James Stavridis. Admiral Stavridis is on to discuss his new book, The Restless Wave, a novel of the U.S. Navy. His previous appearances focused on his works of near futuristic fiction, 2034 and 2054, that looked at the biggest issues of the 21st century, those being geopolitics when it comes to the U.S.-China relationship, and of course the development of new technologies through the lens of fiction to look at today's issues in a way that could allow for a lot of exploration of the different challenges posed by those two topics. With The Restless Wave, though, he's focused on the past. We're going back to an America in the 1930s that through the lens of the Navy, we can look at the challenges that were presented by the coming World War II era amidst a country that was still in the middle of the Great Depression. In many ways, this episode is a great companion to last week's episode with H.W. Brands that focused on the debate over interventionism or isolationism before World War II. Hope you all enjoy the conversation. And a quick note, we released the latest edition of the Realignment Ask Me Anything discussion series earlier last weekend. So if you'd like to take a look at that, go to realignment.supercast.com. Huge thank you to the Foundation for American Innovation for supporting the work of this podcast. Admiral James Stavridis, welcome back to the Realignment.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Incredibly, we're both in Texas today. You're, of course, in Austin. I happen to be in Dallas, so it'll have a little Texas hoedown feel to it.
Yeah, as we're both dressed very, very professionally, not quite matching the aesthetic we just set up there. So I said welcome back because you've been on the show a lot because of how prolific you are from a writing perspective. Folks definitely know you through 2034, 2056. Is this your first solo novel you've put out?
It is, and therefore I'm very proud of it, really ready to go. It's kind of like in Pinocchio, you become a real boy, and now I'm a real novelist in my view, and I'm very happy with this one. It's my 14th book, my third novel, but I would tell anybody it's the best thing I've written, certainly from my perspective. That's for others to judge, of course, but I'm very happy with The Restless Wave, the new book we're going to talk about.
Yeah, and I'll just note here, we're going to get a little inside baseball when it comes to authors here, but I've read a decent proportion of your books. So I want to ask you this question. Which is more interesting, writing about the future or writing about the past? Because 2034, 2056, those are obviously future-facing. Restless Wave is looking at the past.
I have come to prefer the past. And the reason is because you can take liberties with it, but you've got a framework around yourself. And for me, that's a comfortable place to write. And I've always loved history. I've always been a historian. But what you'll see if you read The Restless Wave is that it's a book about the early days of World War II and therefore, obviously, about the past. But it attempts to draw a through line to events of today.
I think what's so interesting is in the opening chapter, it's starting in Hawaii. You're obviously focused on Pearl Harbor in 1941, but very quickly you go back to 1937. And I'm personally, in terms of my World War II history, as I do more of these, I'm more and more compelled from an American perspective by the 1937 to 1940 to 41 period. So yes. What I'd love to hear here is what is your articulation of what the 1937 moment looked like from a global and American perspective?
Yeah, let's begin right there, Marshall, with the setting. It starts in Key West, Florida, kind of in the orbit of Ernest Hemingway, the old-time writer, and the protagonist comes into contact with him. And the context of America in 1937 is frankly not great. We're still coming out of the very difficult events of the Great Depression. We've gone through a period of isolationism, which has really set the country back in many, many ways. And our protagonist, therefore, wants more from his life than to be a fisherman operating in the Florida Keys. So he accepts an appointment to the U.S. Naval Academy, joins military service. But at this point, the armed forces of the United States are kind of small, kind of in disrepair, kind of creaky. And it builds up to 1941 and the attack on Pearl Harbor.
It's really fascinating because when you read about the Army, especially in 1939 to 1940, all of the books that focus on that period will focus on the fact that when they did the big war games in the South and when they did the big processions for FDR and members of his cabinet, oftentimes you'd have to have broomsticks for rifles, or you would have, and I love this image, I hope a movie could someday replicate it, of when they were trying to represent tanks, they would just have a squad of men walk in formation as if they were a tank. The point being, at this point, the Army is underinvested in and is very dilapidated. An officer like Dwight D. Eisenhower has been a major for almost 2 decades. What does the naval side of that unpreparedness picture look like?
Pretty similar. We do have a cadre of high-end ships of the time, which were principally battleships, these massive, huge, big gun ships, 16-inch guns, which can hurl a 2,000-pound projectile. Think firing a car 30 miles. So we had a handful of these, 8 to 10 of them distributed between the two coasts, many of them concentrated, of course, in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. But other than that, the rest of the U.S. Navy is pretty creaky, frankly, and we haven't been attending to shipbuilding. We're behind in many technologies. We don't have enough manning for our ships. So we're kind of unprepared. And what happens? December 7th, 1941, an attack on the fleet, and the entire row of battleships in Pearl Harbor are effectively sunk at the pier. So we start the Second World War in an enormous hole, not only, as you point out correctly, in the Army, but very much in the Navy. And these are the very early days of aviation. So we don't have a lot to throw at the problem, as both Hitler's Germany and Imperial Japan are pounding at both sides.
What's fascinating, too, about the December 7th, 1941 Pearl Harbor, I was about to say incident, but it's much more of an incident, is in many ways the event was presaged. And I'm not referring to like the conspiracy theories, what FDR knowing about it. I'm referring to there had been torpedo plane attacks the British had launched against the Italians that said, hey, capital ships are incredibly vulnerable. Obviously, you had airman Billy Mitchell making clear in the 1920s that capital ships were incredibly vulnerable when it came to bombs. Can you talk about the intellectual side, especially during this 30s period leading to Pearl Harbor? And I think this also speaks to today in terms of like we could see these trends, we could see these ideas forming. I'd love for you to talk about that aspect of this story.
Yeah, in the book, The Restless Wave, we sort of unpackage this, this technology gap, if you will. And as usual in military affairs, the generals and the admirals want to hold on to the old technology. In the naval case, it's the battleships. And the only thing that forces the Admiralty, the Admiral Nimitz, the head of the Pacific Fleet, all of them to kind of come off of this fixation on big gun battleships is the fact that they're all sunk on the first day of the war. So luckily for us, our aircraft carriers are out at sea at this point, and thus that fusion of aviation and ship, as you correctly point out, sort of imagined by a very visionary leader, Billy Mitchell, in the 20s. It's matured at this point, but it's not regarded as the main arm of the fleet. That all changes out of necessity as a result of the attack on Pearl Harbor. And therefore, as you go through the Restless Wave, you're really walking through technological changes that include not only aviation at sea, but new radars that can look out into the distance, new sonars which look undersea and can find submarines, new diesel submarines, much more capable, new combat information centers that are built up inside the ships. Everything is changing at the speed of light, Marshall, and I'll close with this. It's a lot like what we're seeing in Ukraine today, where the rise of drones is, if you will, that new technology that's going to overcome manned aircraft fairly soon, in my view.
Something I'm curious about to build off of that Ukraine example would be, when I speak to folks, especially in the Silicon Valley crowd who are investing in the defense future, I'm always concerned in the back of my mind. Yes, that's all true. But at a certain point, we have a problem we're confronting today dynamic. So we have to both recognize the fact that shipbuilding is a today problem. Drone swarms emerging from ships is a 2027 to 2028 problem. How do you successfully balance these dynamics, both at a military leadership level, but also civilian policymaker level?
Yeah, let me give you a simple way to think about it. Too often, people want to address this kind of dynamic, this kind of question, by thinking like an on and off switch, as in, okay, we ought to just stop investing in our high-end aircraft and our big deck aircraft carriers and click, we ought to be 100% investing in drones, unmanned. That's not the right image. The right image is what's called a rheostat. It's like the dimmer in your dining room that you turn up to make it brighter, you turn down to make it lesser. So the point is, with all these new technologies, Marshall, you're kind of dialing it in, recognizing you're still going to need those legacy systems for some period of time. But ultimately, that dial is inexorably turning toward unmanned. And I want to make an important point for the listeners. Unmanned is not just a drone with a missile on it. That's what people tend to think of. Unmanned is everything from space. Don't forget, a satellite is a drone. It's an unmanned vehicle. Long dwell drones that do carry major surveillance, particularly hyper spectral sensors. The drones people think of, like a Predator or Reaper, single drone, medium size, one missile. Now there are swarm drones that are as small as the laptop on your desk, and you put 1,000 of them and you link them all with artificial intelligence to drones on the surface of the earth, unmanned vehicles, down to the surface of the sea. The Russian Black Sea Fleet has been destroyed, not by Ukrainian destroyers and cruisers. It's been destroyed by Ukrainian surface maritime drones, and all the way down to the bottom of the sea. So this wave of unmanned is moving fast. And in the book about World War II, The Restless Wave, I talk a lot about how these new technologies are forcing these changes. We saw it in World War II. We're seeing it now in Ukraine.
I saw a really useful tweet by someone on the topic of Ukraine's use of seaborne drones, is that because Ukraine doesn't have a navy, they had no choice but to invest in this vision. What makes this difficult from an American perspective is we very much do have a navy. So this is where just turning it down and up is a really relevant way to think about this. I appreciate how, the book is clearly a love letter to the U.S. Navy, but also what you can do successfully in a novel when you've accomplished this is express and give an audience that doesn't have access to experiences like a review into things. So I can't help but notice, and this will be relevant to folks, like when you refer during the book, you talk about like when Scott, the main character, shows up at the Naval Academy, there's references to black shoes. And if you know your World War II history, you think of how within the service of the U.S. Navy, there are black shoes. The black shoes are worn by the surface warfare officers. The brown shoes are worn by the naval aviators. Explain why that distinction really matters in the context of what we see happen over the coming 5 years of war.
Yeah, because the U.S. Navy, like all big organizations, in the end is very tribal. And we think about within the Navy 3 really big tribes. One are the surface warfare officers. That's what I was. Destroyers, cruisers, battleships, the surface ships that ply the oceans of the world. The second big tribe are the aviators, those who fly the aircraft on and off those ships. We even have some land-based aircraft in the Navy that hunt submarines, for example. Separate tribe. Those are the brown shoes. And then the third really big tribe are the submariners, those who dive beneath the surface of the sea. And frankly, in today's world, those nuclear powered submarines, we didn't have those in World War II, obviously. Those were diesel submarines. Today's nuclear submarines can circumnavigate the world without ever broaching the surface. They are the apex predators of the sea because they're largely undetectable and highly lethal. So all of those tribes need markers. And so surface warfare officers wear a particular type of gold set of SWO, surface warfare officer wings. We call them water wings. Aviators wear their wings of gold because they're aviators, they're actual wings. Submariners wear golden dolphins on their chest. And the color of the shoes is just another one of the markers of what tribe you're in. Let me make one other quick point about the Restless Wave, because we've been talking a lot about the military and the war quite accurately. It's also two other things. It's a coming of age novel. It follows this very young, immature, flawed young man from his teenage years in Key West in the 30s through the Naval Academy in the late 30s, and then he graduates into war. He's very unformed, makes a lot of mistakes. And I can look back on young Ensign Stavridis and think about some of those mistakes. This is a coming of age novel. And then secondly, it's a love story, not just about the U.S. Navy, but a literal love story between the protagonist, his best friend, and a beautiful young Hawaiian student, college student. The three of them fall into a complex love triangle with significant challenges and results, all of it with a backdrop of war. So yes, there's a lot going on in the Restless Wave.
Something I'd be curious about, we've never talked about this. What motivated you to join the Navy?
Family business, as is so often the case for people in the U.S. military these days. My father was a career officer, but here's the twist. He was in the U.S. Marine Corps. He fought in the Marines as an officer in World War II, Korea, Vietnam. He ended his career as a full colonel commanding a reinforced Marine battalion in Vietnam in the 1970s. So I grew up around the naval service. And I'll tell you this, Marshall, when I went off to the Naval Academy, initially I wanted to be a Marine infantry officer, just like my father, just like one of the other principal characters in the Restless Wave. But what happened for me was the Naval Academy sends you out to sea in the summer for summer training. And from the moment I was on the deck of a ship, watching a sunset, sailing into San Diego Harbor, I knew I wanted to be not a Marine Corps officer, still wanted to be a naval officer, but a Navy officer. And I became a proud destroyer officer in the U.S. Navy.
That explains a scene pretty early in the book, because obvious question is, like, to what degree are you a stand-in for the main character? And the main character has always wanted to be a surface warfare officer specifically, but for your purposes, his choice, his decision is really validated when he takes that first cruise, which is really key to understand there. You know, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on something that's directly relevant. A lot of listeners to this podcast are going to be younger, and if they're younger, they are going to be coming of age during a period of disillusionment with the U.S. military. There is this ever-present recruitment crisis. I would just love to hear your thoughts on that issue specifically, because this is also a way that 1937 to 1940 also perfectly rhymes. The disillusionment of today is fueled by the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the political division that emerged from it, to the 2008 financial crisis. Back then, it's the Great War. It's the Great Depression. Talk about how these moments rhyme.
They do indeed. And in particular, here's something that's powerful and important to know, and then something that is very, very troubling. I'll start with the troubling one. The thing that is troubling in how these moments rhyme is the internal divisions in society that come out of these big external crises. You know, we tend to look back with very rose-colored glasses at the Second World War and say, well, you know, everybody pulled together. It was just fabulous. We knew what we had to do. You know, in the years leading up to World War II, there was enormous division in the country about whether we ought to even think about getting involved in these crazy wars in Europe, where this guy called Hitler was taking over the continent and threatening the British. or over in the Pacific, where Imperial Japan was conquering China and threatening Burma and threatening the British possessions there. And there was a great division in the country and isolationism, and people felt it's not our business. Let's just come home, let the world sort it all out. Well, how did that work out? It didn't. And of course, the Japanese pulled us into the war by striking at Pearl Harbor. And then people don't appreciate this. And then the reason we got in the European war was because Hitler declared war on us after the Japanese attack. So at that point, yes, we were in it. Here I come to the good part of the Rhine, which is that in the end, Americans do pull together. And we certainly did ultimately in the Second World War magnificently. By the end of that war, we were pulling together as a nation. And I know it's fashionable to feel the country's polarized and pulling apart, and I get all that, and it certainly is. I'm confident we will find our way back together, and hopefully it won't require a huge external crisis to cause that to occur, but that we'll find our way forward, and that's in our DNA, and I think we'll get there as Americans.
I think I've been doing a lot of reading on this period, as I said, and I was reading a book by David Brinkley, long passed away, but it was about Washington, D.C. in the lead up to war. And he described isolationism as a term that, quote, says too much and says too little. And that's just really struck with me. I really like that quote. I'd love to ask you about it. What's your just immediate reaction to that statement?
I think it's correct as follows. I think there's a tendency when the word is used to use it in a very hyperbolic way, that isolationism means we're just going to cut off all contact with the world and step away completely. That's a recipe for failure. And that's where you get to the minimalist use of it. You need to understand what the implications are if you're going to go down that path. And you can do so up to a point, but then you hit a breaking point. I'll give you the historical analog, and it's from just before the period you're reading. It's in the 20s when we come out of World War I and we say, okay, we got through World War I. We saved our British cousins. Typically the British is how this is framed, but also the French from the German war machine, World War I. What did we do? We came home. We didn't leave any troops there. We rejected the League of Nations, the predecessor to the United Nations. We built trade and tariff barriers, Hawley-Smoot tariffs. And we thought to ourselves, hey, we can grow it here. We can educate ourselves here. We can manufacture it here. We can do everything we need here. We got these two huge oceans to protect us. We don't want to be involved in the world. Well, how'd that work out? You can drop a plumb line from the global economy cracking because of the trade war that we started, to the rise of fascism, to the Second World War, and us getting pulled back into it. So from my view, and this I think is what Brinkley is probably referring to, you don't want to be hyperbolic about this, but you want to understand the nuance of the path of isolation. And it's a dangerous path, especially for a country as embedded in the global markets and economies as to the degree that we are.
I like that answer because it gets to the fact that sometimes isolationist is used as a slur. And I think there are people who the slur is quite valid to apply it to, but isolationism, especially the minimalist version you referred to, also speaks to a competing value set and set of language we have as Americans, right? This is where John Quincy Adams and not going abroad, sneaking monsters, there's a broader history here. And I think if we just understand it within that context of these are competing values, it's easier to get to the answer that I think you and I share today, but also not necessarily having to say every single person who's skeptical about intervention moving beyond just our own continent. I think that's just a key point that we could arrive at.
Yeah, let's go back to what we were talking about a few moments ago in military technology and apply the same idea here. This is not an on and off switch. You don't have to be the world's policeman or completely isolated from the world. You got to kind of dial it in and find the place you want to be on that spectrum. And I think it's a very legitimate, defendable intellectual position to say that America has dialed that rheostat excessively to the engagement side at cost, like Vietnam, like most obviously and recently Afghanistan. On the other hand, I would say, by dialing that rheostat of engagement, we've had some significant successes. Persian Gulf War #1, where we threw out Saddam Hussein, a vicious dictator. The Balkans, a crisis 20 years ago where it looked a lot like Syria does today. Colombia, where the FARC rebels were about to take over the country. So we've had our successes, we've had our failures. The point is, you neither want to be the world's policeman, sort of charged with solving all the world's problems. We don't have the capacity or the desire to do that, nor, my view, do you want to be completely isolationist and step away from places where American leadership really matters. And you quoted John Quincy Adams a moment before. Let's go to our founding father, George Washington, who said, beware of entangling alliances. It's a very defendable position. I'm going to be one who's a little bit more toward that international side. There can be others who are a little less side. What you want to avoid is the on and off switch approach here of either 1,000% in policing the world or the hell with them all, we're just going to come home. Neither of those are good positions.
I really like making the off and on switch dynamic part of our conversation, because oftentimes on online formats or in books or, when you're going on TV, like there's a rhetorical need when you're trying to make your 30-second media hit make sense to say, this is the perfect, most articulated black and white version of this. But there's a difference when you're actually sitting as a policymaker, having to make those. And very rarely are you offered, actually, I would say you pretty much never are truly offered from a no trade-offs perspective, that version. So for the last
Can I just please, for 1 second, go back to the Restless Wave in the Second World War? Here is one of those very few moments, and it's following the attack on Pearl Harbor. That's not a moment for negotiation. That's a moment to stand and deliver and attack. And I think that's an example of something I try and unpackage in the book, The Restless Wave, because, we talk a lot these days about, oh my gosh, what if we get in a war with China? That would be so terrible. And I agree, it would be horrible to be in a war, two great powers in the war in the Pacific. Well, we don't have to imagine how horrible that would be. We kind of know, because of World War II in the Pacific really was one of those dramatic moments when there was no other path than a movement toward a demand for unconditional surrender.
Something I'm curious about in this last section then would be a key rhetorical, not trick, but something you're doing in this conversation and is made clear at the start of the book, is that so much of the American conception in the 30s, when there's sympathy towards the isolationist position, is we're between two oceans, we're on our own continent, we have our own Western hemisphere, all that's over there. Like there's a point where, the main character is sort of like, I don't know what the Republicans or the nationalists are in Spain. I've never heard of X, Y, or Z place in the Pacific. Why, to what degree does that concern me? Do I need to start learning more? What World War II really changes, though, missiles, the V-2 rockets, nuclear weapons, strategic bombing, they just completely obviate the reality that we could just separate things hemispherically in a straightforward way. So to be honest, just to turn to the last second dunking part of the episode, I'm sure you saw the kerfuffle over Tucker Carlson speaking with a historian, quote unquote, who, really was against American intervention in World War II. I just genuinely don't understand, even beyond just sort of being triggered at the sort of reverence for Nazism, just the idea that you ever could have had a world where the Germans develop V3 missiles and the German atomic weapons program advances further. It's just hard to imagine a world where it's just treating as if the 1930s were going to be the 1930s in history beforehand was going to be a long-term viable option. So I just think it's so important that we really understand that reality, which is that it's sort of unfashionable to say, we're global citizens, the world's interconnected, we all rise and fall together. But it's actually true in this case. So I'd love to hear just you reflect on that entire kerfuffle.
Yeah, I'll start with what would have happened. This is the whole alternative history, and there's a rich literature of this. Man in the High Tower by Philip Dick, both Munich and Fatherland by Robert Harris. There are multiple extraordinary novels that explore what it would have been like if Hitler had gotten the bomb first. Very different world. If the United States had decided not to proceed into the war. Even after the attack on Pearl Harbor, it wasn't a given that we would then go to war in Europe. There are these
Hitler made that choice for us, to your point earlier.
Correct, exactly. But I think that it was the right choice in both cases to go after both Hitler's Germany and the imperial Japanese government, really a military claque under an emperor who was sort of shoved off to the side by his admirals and generals. So we had very little choice there. But the idea that somehow we can look back and say, we could have negotiated an outcome after Pearl Harbor with the Japanese, or even, if only we'd let the Japanese have access to more fuel and rubber and raw materials. That's really what they wanted. And, Hitler never would have actually invaded Great Britain. All wrong. That's just magical thinking. And I'll give you a current day example of it. And I get this a lot. And I think it also came up in that Tucker Carlson charade with that professor, which is, if only NATO hadn't expanded at the end of the Cold War, Putin never would have invaded Ukraine. If only the West had been more respectful of Putin, we wouldn't be where we are today. I'm sorry, that's just magical thinking. For decades, the only tanks of conquest moving across Europe went from Russia into Europe. That would be the Red Army raping its way across Germany at the end of World War II. That would be 1956, when Russian tanks crushed Budapest, Hungary. 1968.
And a quick note for folks who don't know, 1956 is an Eastern European country not wanting to be a part of the Warsaw Pact. We've yet to have America have to intervene against NATO membership.
Exactly my point. In 1968, same thing happens in Prague, and the Prague Spring is crushed. Gdansk in Poland. Europeans know, and they have seen it again and again and again, Russian tanks roll west into Europe. I defy you and any professor and Tucker Carlson, open that book of history, your point, and show me that, that page where American tanks rolled to the east, or NATO tanks rolled into the Baltic states and forced them to join NATO. That's ridiculous. All of those nations begged to join NATO, and you would too if you were a Lithuanian and had lived for decades with a Russian boot on your throat. So this kind of magical thinking, and it bleeds into the really horrible conspiracy theories about the Holocaust didn't happen. I've been to Yad Vashem. I've seen the records. I've lit a torch there. It's real. It happened. And it was a monstrous regime. And we are all a better world for us having crushed it when we did.
To just quickly answer, I'm sure a certain segment of the podcast responds to you when it comes to, but what interest it is of us to, so sure, let's just say not just by your history, like these are facts. Let's just accept those facts. Why was it in the American interest to let those begging Baltic countries into NATO in the first place? Like, what is the American interest? I think the key thing to understand NATO, and this is what really solidifies NATO for me, is NATO is a response to a policy dilemma, which is if Europe is a contested continent where powers, rising or otherwise, perceive they can gain territory, they can gain resources, that leads to massive intercontinental worlds that rapidly involve the rest of the world. Like, and we did this twice over. So the reason why it's in an American interest, you could totally hate Lithuanians. You could have total beef with all of the Baltic countries, but it's in our interest to have a world where Russia knows they cannot invade those countries, and then we have peace and stability. So I think that's just like the key thing, which is you can still not care at all about universal values like democracy and say, hey, the fact that my generation was not expected to get drafted when we were 18 to go fight for a peaceful Europe that had brought it in the United States is, I think, a real serious accomplishment.
100% correct. And in addition to the kind of moral, ethical, long-term world argument, I'm going to add the economic piece of this, which is that it's immensely in the interest of the United States for there to be a free market where a nation, let's say China, for example, can't decide, you know what, those chip manufacturing facilities over there on the island of Taiwan, those look pretty tasty. I think I'll just go ahead and conquer them. And, what happens to our industry? What happens to the global market? So there's a driving economic imperative here. And there is also the moral, ethical, right thing to do. And then finally, your point, I think there's a significant national security perspective here. If we don't be involved in the world, using our allies, not the world's policemen, we're kind of the conductor of a big band with a lot of band members. But if we don't do that, the jungle grows back, and that chaos will come back to haunt us. And I think for all those reasons, a rational, sensible placement of that rheostat, not jammed over to the position of world policeman, but for God's sake, let's not repeat the mistakes of the 20s and 30s and return to pure isolationism. The jungle grew back pretty fast, and we had to lose a lot of blood and treasure to reestablish a world that was, frankly, to our advantage.
So last question will let us take us out on the Restless Wave. One of the best reflections I saw on the Tucker Carlson interview was a historian pointing out, because I think what was so shocking for people was that not just sort of Elon's late stage Twitter/X. Of course, there are a bunch of like accounts saying, go Tucker, like this is awesome. But I actually did like semi-organically see like a lot of people be like, well, actually, let's ask questions. And actually, like, why can't we ask about the received narrative? And this historian pointed out that the reason why at a minimum level this is happening is that like we've just truly moved on from the World War II generation. And World War II is now, it's no longer the beginning of Band of Brothers where you're seeing the easy company vets be interviewed about the actual experience. So now World War II exists as a myth, as a story, as a story in our current moment. Everyone loves unpacking stories. So can you just close us out talking about like writing about World War II now that it has, I think, transitioned into the pantheon of mythic stories that we tell about ourselves, the West, et cetera?
Yeah, first and foremost, every nation's history is a series of stories about its hero generations. And we've had not just the greatest generation, which is what is at the heart of the Restless Wave, but we've had other hero generations, to say the least, in this country. I think of the Battle of Gettysburg and Joshua Chamberlain, a one-star general in the Union Army from Maine, breaks the phalanx of the Confederate Army. Who knows what would have happened if he had not stood firm at that moment? And go back to our founding father, George Washington, and the winter of Valley Forge, and the stolen march into New York, and the Battle of Yorktown, where French allies came to rescue and help us against the British. We've had a lot of hero generations, and we need to know those stories. And tell those stories. And I firmly believe another hero generation will be called upon to face some great challenge ahead of us. Could be a pandemic much more lethal than the one we just went through. Could be an authoritarian war begun by some combination of Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, all the above. There'll be other crises ahead of us if we don't pay attention to the stories of the hero generations before us, like the stories of World War II in the Pacific and the Restless Wave. That next generation will not be prepared for what comes.
And the last actual thing here, when you reference hero generations, I'll do a quick shout out to Neil Howe, William Strauss. Neil Howe, they coined generational speaking in those senses. The books get a little kooky at certain points. Neil's been on the podcast, but I think as an archetypal framework, I think this is a useful way to think of the things. Admiral, this has been so great. I'm looking forward to having you on when you do your next book. They're pretty prolific, as I pointed out, but this has been a real pleasure.
It's my pleasure. And what a wonderful, wide-ranging conversation from history to our society to our hero generations. It's a good place to finish it. Thanks for having me on to talk about the Restless Wave.